welcome to this Real News program. I'm Eddie Conway, and this is Real Talk. And this is our 10th program, so bear with me for a minute. Baltimore has a lot of problems, crime, unemployment, poverty, gentrification, and you can just go on and on and on. Part of the problem is that a lot of people in the black community don't have decent housing and don't have communities that represent decent housing. And it goes back to red line districting. It goes back to big banks taking advantage of people and people's grandparents. It's an issue that stems all the way back to slavery. When Africans that were enslaved here in America was set free, they were promised land as reparation. That promise was reneged on, it was broken, and because of that, they had to struggle, and their descendants had to struggle, and we're still struggling as a result of that 250 years of free labor. And we can see the results of it here in Baltimore City as well as we can see it in many other cities. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the issue of reparation, and we're going to look at how the city is dealing with the housing issues and how the city is supporting big developers and supporting gentrification and not supporting building up the communities. And toward that end, we have some community land trust representatives with us that think that there is a different way, a different strategy in which we can build our communities rather than to give tax breaks to big developers that don't, in fact, give jobs to people in the city. But before we go to that point, we're going to start with looking back for a minute. So we have with us tonight Professor Catherine Franks. She's a professor of, and I hope I get this right, gender, sexuality, law at Columbia University, and she runs one of the centers there, and she has done a book that looks at reparation, and she makes the case that at some point we did get land, and shortly thereafter, after the assassination of Lincoln, I believe, the land was stolen back. And so she makes that case, and when we look at that, then we'll look at where we are today after that. So join me, please, in welcoming Professor Franks. Okay, so you got it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Conway. Thank you, Ida Bees, for welcoming me here. I'm Catherine Franke. I'm a professor of law at Columbia University. First thing I want to say is that I want to honor the Shinnehanek people on whose land we now sit, stand, wherever, what you're doing. Often slavery is referred to as the original sin of this country, but really it's among the two, I think, original sins that were at the founding of this country, and the dispossession of Native people is certainly among them. I also want to say I come from New York, a rat-infested city. I mean, I literally have traps on my front stoop of my house, and I catch rats every damn night. So I don't know what your deal is here, but between the train station and getting here, I did not see one rat. We sent our biggest rat to the White House, right? And that is his hometown, New York City, which is truly rat-infested. So Baltimore seems like a lovely, charming place, and I just want to thank you for welcoming me here and for holding these sorts of events, these sorts of conversations in this wonderful, wonderful space. So I've written a book on how we might understand the kind of amazing work that's being done here in Baltimore around community land trusts as having absolute connections to slavery in the United States, and to the fact that we never actually made enslaved people free. We freed them, but we never made them free. And we are living with that legacy today. And it's part of what I think needs to inform on a national level, certainly the question of reparations. But what I recommend in the end of the book is that we accomplish reparations through community land trusts, which is why I think the work that's being done here in Baltimore is so incredibly important. So I want to ask the hard question of what does it mean to be free? How do we get free? As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor asks in her work, which inspires me a great deal. Not only how do the descendants of formerly enslaved people be free, Black people, African American people more generally in this country, be free from the weight, the burden, the horror of white supremacy in this country, but how do white people as well and the larger society get free of that history that favors us, that has always benefited us? So as a white person, I feel an enormous responsibility to talk about this issue and not just say it's for you people to figure out, right, and to convince our elected officials. It's something I have benefited from, I benefit from every day, and it's something we all have to be talking about, but we have different stakes in it, to be sure. So the first thing I want to do is just bring into the room the people that I have spent a lot of time with, which are enslaved people in South Carolina and Mississippi. And you'll learn in a minute why I think those two locations are so important. This is from the Sea Islands, from Beaufort, South Carolina, an incredibly, heartbreakingly beautiful place. If you've been there, you know that the land, the ocean, the islands are incredibly beautiful. And this is an enslaved family living in a small home in Beaufort, enslaved by one of the several white families that owned so much of the Black population in that area. In 1860, when this picture was taken, 4 million Black people were enslaved in the United States. That was 90% of the Black population of the United States. Right? Virtually everyone who was Black, and I use the term Black, not African American, from that period because they were not Americans. Right? They were Africans, but they were certainly not Americans. But to be Black was to be a slave, or to be enslaved during that period. So here we have a huge extended family from that period, and I want to bring them in the room as well. Some of you may be descendants of slaves, some of you may not. But this is our history, and these are the people I feel we are honoring when we're talking about reparations today, and I want to bring their spirits, their lives, their pain, and their joy into the room with us. This picture, if you can see it, it's also from South Carolina, incredibly devastating picture. There's a young child standing in the front, and what you'll see about that child is that he or she doesn't have pants on. Up to a certain age, you are not allowed to wear pants as an enslaved child, right? And so we see this sort of physical degradation and vulnerability that was the condition of being enslaved in 1860 and 1861. And then here we have a very moving picture of 3 generations of enslaved people, also in the Sea Islands, who the next day are also in this picture, and the only difference between the picture before of their family and the picture after is that there's a white man standing there. This is what it meant to be free, to be freed in the Sea Islands was to have a white person show up and declare them freed. So in 1861, the Northern troops moved through the Sea Islands. The slave owners fled to the mainland, and about 10 to 15,000 enslaved black people were left on the islands. This was their home. It was the only land they'd ever known, and they were not leaving. So when the white federal troops showed up, and we see this picture of this man standing there, a military official, declaring them free, their lives looked no different on the days that they were freed than the day before when they were enslaved. And part of why I think we need to face this problem that we've inherited generation after generation after generation of the way in which land is owned, occupied, and wealth is generated from that land as a deeply racial project is the fact that we never actually made these people free. We didn't give them the tools, the resources, the land that they needed to actually live free lives. So there are two different stories of what could happen in this moment where federal troops appear and say, magically, you are freed. We could have taken reparations seriously. And we have a military general, if I can go back, General Sherman, who was one of the administrators of this area, who was in charge of the formerly enslaved people that they found in the Sea Islands, who said they had been the only cultivators of this land. Their labor had given it all its value, the elements of its fertility, where the sweat and blood of the Negro so long poured out upon it, that it might be taken as composed of his own substance. And I can't read with your logo at the bottom there, the whole of it was under a foreclosed mortgage for these formerly enslaved people. There was a very clear understanding that they were owed the land that they had farmed for generations. And what happened in the Sea Islands and what happened in Mississippi is they were given the land expressly as reparations, land that had been seized from the slave owners who had left. And the notion was, you're not getting that land back. You're certainly not getting your enslaved people back, and you're not getting that land back because it is a foreclosed mortgage on both the unpaid wages of stolen labor, of what it meant to be enslaved, the indignity, the horror, the terror, the violence, the rape, the death, the family separation that was enslavement. But also there was this notion that you would need resources prospectively in the future to live a free life. Right? So the land was understood as payment for all of that. And it was just incredible. What you saw were black families lining up and claiming the land collectively in community land trusts. Right? And this was their first act of freedom, was signing their names on deeds. And because they couldn't write their own names, because it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read or write, they signed their names with an X. And I have a closer picture here. As I went through these archives and touched these papers, for the first time, no one had touched them since the 1860s. Out would fall pieces of hair, a hair. You'd see a smudge of a thumbprint from the ink, or the side of a hand, as people signed their names. I just found it incredibly moving. These were the first acts of freedom that these people were awarded, were won in this period, and they were given the land in these beautiful little maps that they created also, where they would make collective family and community claim to the land, which they were awarded, as I said, in South Carolina and in Mississippi. So what happens, in 8th grade history, Lincoln was assassinated. A new racist president comes into office. All of this land is violently taken away from the people who had been promised it and who had papers with their names on it that they had signed, that they said were good deeds to the land. the government said, oh no, those papers are useless, they're worthless, and we're going to make you stay here and work as contract laborers for the people who enslaved you before. Right? We will award that land back to the people who had held you in bondage, and we will ignore any kind of reparation due to you other than merely setting you free, which of course was important, but it wasn't enough. So what has happened to this land? Right? We see, actually in a period just after that time, these mobile prisons in the area. This is where many black men lived and ended up having to work in conditions where they were held in these double-decker wagons and then released to work for the day and then put back in those double-decker wagons, these horrible holding pens, basically, for people. And this is what it meant to be free. Not in 1865, not in 1900, but in 1910, when we thought that the horror of the Civil War was behind, or excuse me, the horror of slavery was behind us. So the very land that I had showed you a moment ago with that map and people's signatures, what's happened to it now? It is this lovely gated community in South Carolina, the Pleasant Point Plantation. Really beautiful little place. They have, if you read through here, lovely little story about the land and who had owned it before. No, there's some discussion of servants, no mention of slavery, no mention of the land being given as reparations and stolen. There's a very romantic story for white people to feel good about and feel sort of innocent about owning this land. They have lovely little holiday parties that you can look at on their website. Right? That's who's there now. And the fact that we don't know this history makes them feel like they have no responsibility for who's in that space, who should be in that space, and why those people in that community, those white people, have so much more resources and family wealth than their African American neighbors who still live in many respects in horrible, horrible housing. Right? So this, we could tell a very similar story up here in Baltimore about who got land, how land was distributed, because at the very same time that this story is going on in the 1860s and 70s, land was being given away to white people in the western part of the United States for free. But black people, formerly enslaved people, were told, no, you can't have it. So this is just a very arresting picture that I return to. It's the cover of the book. And then the last thing I just want to say is we're still coming for a check. And I say we because these are community-based projects. I would not be the beneficiary of a community land trust, nor should I be. I would not be the beneficiary of reparations, nor should I be, although my family came to the United States much later than this period. Very often you hear white people saying, you know, I don't have any responsibility for this. My family didn't own slaves. Therefore, I'm off the hook. Well, my people benefit from white supremacy, which is the ideology that made black people enslavable in the first place. And as I said when I opened, I benefit from it all the time and need to own that and be free of it. So part of what I just find so amazing about Baltimore is the work that you activists are doing here. And so I want to welcome you guys up to the stage. We are coming for you guys are coming for your check. You're working on community land trusts, which is what I recommend at the end of the book that we do to make reparations real today. And the work is just so important. And I understand next week you actually have a pretty important moment that will be happening locally where the research, the organizing, the planning, the movement building, the hard thinking about what community land trusts might look like may actually take a new step towards actual realization. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening to my history story. History's over. Well, history's never over. But the professor part of the evening is over. And I want to hand it back to
all right, thank you.
Our able leader, yes. Mr. Conway.
Yes, what we're going to do is we're going to invite some representatives from land trusts here in Baltimore up to the stage. But just before we do that, we want to look at this report that we have put together to show how developers and the land trust is working here in Baltimore and the land trust fund. Can we have that package?
Donald Trump has called Baltimore rat-infested, a place no one wants to live. But in fact, there are people who not only want to live here,
Whose city? Our city. Whose city? Our city.
but are waging a historic campaign to create safe, affordable, and community-controlled housing, a critical part of making a city livable.
Affordable housing is a huge, huge issue. It's very important because you see homes like these to the left of me that are run down, and some slumlords or people that want to capitalize on the residents of Baltimore, they would come in and just do subpar work.
Since 2016, United Workers and the Fair Development Roundtable have led efforts to create the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, a government entity tasked with distributing millions of dollars for fair housing in a city that's faced a massive shortage for decades.
Our fund. Whose city? Our city. Whose city?
We fought for 2 years, canvassing in the blazing hot sun during summer, to not only create the fund, but make sure that the money goes into the fund.
The city is expected to start accepting applications for the program this fall, and advocates like Destiny Watford, winner of the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize, are demanding the fund be used for the purpose they envisioned, creating housing that's livable and attainable for the average resident.
We know how to fight, and I just want to remind you guys of that if the money, for whatever reason it seems like it's not going to go where it needs to go to permanently affordable housing, we will fight you. Not physically, don't be afraid.
The history of housing policy in Baltimore helps explain the city's shocking disparities in wealth, income, life expectancy, and economic mobility. It's one of the worst cities to grow up poor and black in America. In 1910, Baltimore pioneered residential segregation. The 30s brought New Deal government programs that created generational wealth, if you were white. For black communities, it was predatory capitalism, redlining, blockbusting, all rooted in legal discrimination. The civil rights movement brought some relief. Empowered by the Fair Housing Act, the feds went after landlords like Donald Trump, who was sued by the DOJ in the 1970s for discriminating against black tenants. Today, the Fair Housing Act is under attack. Leaked documents reveal the Trump administration is seeking to gut provisions aimed at preventing discrimination by landlords. Rather than focusing on a profit margin, Baltimore's fair housing movement seeks to address this crisis through community empowerment. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund mandates the city spend $20 million a year to create affordable housing and another $20 million to address Baltimore's roughly 16,000 vacants. This approach lies in sharp contrast with the billions in taxpayer subsidies given to wealthy and well-connected developers that have defined Baltimore housing policies for decades, but have failed to address the need for affordable housing, which has remained staggering. Some 1 in 10 residents are on the wait list for subsidized housing vouchers. And as city officials prepared to launch the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, advocates packed a meeting in Curtis Bay on July 24th and released a report outlining their demands. The land must be under community control through models like land trusts or cooperatives, and the program must center racial and economic justice.
So what we want to do is strongly recommend that the Department of Community and Development take on our priorities when it comes to selecting who gets the money. It's not going towards developers who might use it for something else.
Collective action built on community power, which offers a powerful rebuttal to the narrative put forth by Baltimore's detractors.
So that's a little overview of the work that's been going on in the city with the city council by organizers, and we have tonight with us 2 of them. Ariana Foster.
Hi.
Okay, she's with United Workers, which is a human rights organization here in Baltimore. She also works with the Roundtable. She works with Charm City Land Trust, and she does other work. So she's going to be able to share with us some of that work and some of the ideas And I'm sorry if I'm messing up names, but we have Terrell Askin, also with the United Workers, and I know for a fact that he's building in Remington. He's also working to build a land trust in Remington, and he works also with the Round Table, and together they have been pushing this effort over in City Council. So, Foster, Terrell, thank you for joining me. Talk a little bit. Next week, over in City Council, something important is going to happen that's going to impact us down on the ground in the city around the land trust fund. Can both of y'all talk about it? You could start first and then you could follow.
Yeah, so like was reported, the Fair Development Roundtable, formerly known as the Baltimore Housing Roundtable, has been working since 2013 to advance a policy vision in the city that would promote fair development and community control of land. And so in 2016, we did a ballot initiative to amend the city's charter to create the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is a fund designed to create and preserve deeply affordable housing in the city. It took a lot of work over the following 2 years, organizing in the community, talking with residents about their concerns and their priorities, continuing to build public pressure on the city to actually get resources into the trust fund. And so now, after a lot of organizing, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund will see resources every year. This year, there's expected to be $15 million in the fund, and it's going to go up until it meets the $20 million every year that was our demand. And so right now, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Commission is meeting to create criteria and guidelines for how those resources will be used. And so this is a critical and urgent moment to ensure that there is accountability around these resources that we fought so hard for. It's our fund. We did the work. We led the way, and we're going to continue to do that. And so what's critical about this next meeting, which is next Tuesday at the DHCD office, just down the street from here, is that we will hear a response to the criteria we put forward at the August trust fund meeting. This report outlines work that our commissioners and our members have been doing over months to consider how do we have a strong accountability mechanism for these resources so that every year we can rely on those guidelines to ensure that these resources go to the needs we identified. And essentially, we put forward a clear demand at the last commission meeting that if proposals that come to this fund, if their plan does not promote race equity, community control, and permanent affordability, they need not apply. And so, recognizing that those are key elements that have been missing from the housing landscape, and it's a big part of the reason why there is widespread housing instability in the city. And so we made our demands very clear. The report that we put forward talks about our criteria, about how we will advance those goals and ensure that these resources can actually transform our communities and do what we fought for it to do. And at next week's meeting, we will hear a response to the criteria we put forward. And so it's critical that we continue to push for accountability around these resources until what our priorities are actually reflected in how the resources get distributed.
Terrell, you got something to add to that, of course.
I think she did a very good job of explaining it. Okay. I can kind of touch on how the priorities came about. as Adriana mentioned, during the 2-year fight, part of the things that we began, like as the Fair Development Roundtable at the time, the Baltimore Housing Roundtable, to look at was what priorities did this fund need to uphold? Oh, sorry.
What's it closer to your mouth?
Sorry. Yes, what priorities did this fund need to uphold in order to create transformations in our neighborhoods? And we began by looking at other models around our nation, and we started to see certain things that we knew we didn't see in our housing situations now. Community control is a unrealized aspect of our communities currently. Permanent affordability, which is basically that the property should be affordable. The way I like to say it, affordable forever. We know that with these kind of programs, they have the ability to gentrify our neighborhoods, and the people who put in the work to actually be in those neighborhoods overnight can't afford to live there any longer. And we knew that we didn't want to create a tool as poor people to build our power in our communities to basically then throw us out using them. Basically, over months, beginning in like November of last year, we began working as a work group around not only looking at these models, but breaking them down and looking at one of the things the Roundtable is known for is our, sorry.
Sorry about that.
I thought I'd been buzzed. For our, what is our fair development principles, which is transparency, accountability, participation. Sorry.
Equity and
Equity.
universality.
Thank you. Thank you. And so when we looked at the funding source, when we looked at the trust fund, we began building out how do we actually take what we see around the nation, what we don't see in our communities, and align them with our values. And so that is how we actually went about. That's a short way of saying how we came about with working on this and presenting it to DHCD and the commission.
Well, now, you heard, both of y'all heard the presentation by Professor Frank. Do you think this land trust fund stuff will actually be beneficial to us in terms of reparation? I mean, how are we going to take advantage of it, and who's gonna end up with it?
I think community land ownership is a critical piece in how we create stability and also have self-determination in our communities. And so there are community land trusts throughout the city. We are collaborating on how to build our impact, how to continue to have democratic institutions in our neighborhoods. And we are situated in areas that for an incredibly long time have been at the whims of the marketplace and of profit-making developments. And so it's critically important that if we are going to end a legacy that has oppressed and displaced and disregarded our neighborhoods, that we put the power and control in the hands of our neighborhoods and our neighbors. And so the community land trust work is growing, and it's a way of addressing needs, and it's a way of creating housing that is removed from the marketplace. The market is never going to uphold our human right to housing, and so if we don't create a way to have investment in our communities that doesn't then turn around and displace us because of rising property values or raising rents, then we're going to continue to have this type of problem. And so I think that in order to end a legacy of racist housing policy and racist development, we have to have development that's driven by our communities. And that's what community land trusts allow us to do. Community land trust and community land ownership.
You got something to add? Was there anything left?
The only thing that I would add is I think that this goes, community land trust goes a long way to addressing reparations, partly because one of the things that I've learned through this work is housing is one aspect of how we see racial inequality. There's also like environmental inequality, as Professor Frank put forward, economic inequality, and all of these things are tied to land. In order to be self-determinate, you need to have community control and the ability for the community to actually not only determine what it wants to see in its community, but to actually work to create that vision. And that's personally why I believe that community land trust is absolutely necessary to the vision of fair development.
Okay, so next week, am I on? I am, I'm on, okay. Next week, next Tuesday, there'll be some sort of hearing. What's our next step? What do we do? People that's involved in the land trust, people that's concerned about how this fund is gonna be used. What do we need to be doing next week, next Tuesday?
Well, first, you need to show up. And I say that because this is one of the things
Oh,
that...
excuse me, show up where?
Oh, to the the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Commission meeting, which is next Tuesday at 5:30 at the DHCD office, which is down the street.
417 East Fayette Street.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, go ahead.
And to not only show up, but to voice your concerns, your why you actually are there, why you support this, so that it's understood that this is our vision, and we have to make that space our space. There's also, I don't have one right now, unfortunately. There are postcards that were actually one of my colleagues, that we're asking people if they have time to be able to fill them out, just with a message of how you feel about community land trusts. What do you think of community control and support, permanent affordability, racial equity? Because we know that we all are busy, we don't all necessarily are able to be in that space, but our voices can be. And so packing their mailboxes, so to speak, with our voices and our vision. I'm gonna turn it over to Adriana so that she can add anything that I've missed.
Yeah, in addition to signing a postcard and sharing your concerns, or attending the meeting yourself and bringing your friends, your neighbors, your network, join us at the roundtable. It is a coalition of renters, homeowners, and people with the experience of homelessness all working towards fair development in Baltimore. And so if you are interested in where this movement is going and how we continue to build, please let us know. We meet at 2640 St. Paul Street pretty much every fourth Thursday of the month. And if you want more information about how to get involved, how to become a member, how to help us grow this work, then please come talk to us.
Let me just, and this is the last question, then I'm going to open this up for questions from the floor. But I'm curious now, because just listening to this makes me think that the decision makers about how this fund is used is not in our hands or not in our control. And that concerns me. I mean, who's making the decisions about where this $15 million is going to be spent and who's going to get it? And if it's not us, then what do we need to do about it, for real? You. Yes. Foster.
Oh, me. Okay. So the commission was a structure that we wanted to be a part of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund when we designed it, because we wanted more participation from community residents. And so the commission is made up of a group of people that have a different set of experiences. There's a nonprofit developer, there's a person with the experience of homelessness, there's a person who is a voucher holder, and there's other criteria for who sits on that commission. Because we wanted to uphold our values as much as we could in the process. So we wanted more participation and we wanted more accountability. And so the commission, there are trust fund commissioners who share our values and our vision and are fighting for this criteria to be what the commission adopts as the guidelines for the fund. DHCD, they are considered the decision makers, and they're taking information
Who is that?
The Department of Housing and Community Development.
Okay.
And so this body is supposed to support developing criteria and guidelines and reviewing and essentially creating some oversight into how the resources are used. And what we are advocating for is that this commission isn't viewed as just a group to show paperwork to after the decisions are made, but that they actually have true decision-making power as they are a representative or a group that's representing us and our interests as residents. And so really, we want to strengthen the power of this commission and ensure that as they are actually voicing our concerns, they're making sure that we can have a space to guide and shape and cultivate this new source of funds, that DHCD takes them seriously and takes us seriously.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll open the floor for questions. We have a mic there, and so anybody that has a question can line up at the mic and address it to anyone on the panel, including myself. Are there any questions? Line up there, please, sir.
Is the commission taking any testimonies other than showing up at the hearing? And besides the cards, can you actually send a testimony or support to somewhere for the commission?
Yes, so one important aspect that the commissioners that are working with us have been putting forward is that these meetings should take place in community. They shouldn't always be at City Hall, and so that's one way that they're advocating so that there is meaningful participation sought out from residents, and that this is taking place where they have access to the conversation. They also have made it a point to, at every meeting, hear testimony from people who are in the room, so that there is actually a space for dialogue, for people to voice their concerns. And the postcards are just one way that we wanted to have a space for written comment to go to the trust fund commissioners, but I think we can be as creative as we want to about how we're going to continue to make demands on this group and on these resources.
Thanks. Yeah. Check, check. Yeah, I just wanted to know if you could share some examples about cities where community land trusts have been successful and where they've had the kind of authority, the commissions have had the kind of authority that you're seeking, and what the impact has been.
There have been a number of cities around the country where community land trusts have been one of the main focuses of community organizing. I spent a bunch of time in Jackson, Mississippi. Wait, you're over here. Where Cooperation Jackson and other local activists, and the mayor of Jackson used to be part of this organizing before he became mayor, have actually gotten the city to sell them for $1 sections of the city that have been abandoned otherwise. And not only are they're building housing through the community land trust model, where the community decides what the housing will look like, who will live there, what it will mean to be a member of that community, but they're also building urban farms because they want their food sources to be independent of a for-profit model, as well as housing to be independent of a for-profit model. And they've also taken steps to be energy independent. So they're putting in solar panels and wind farms and things like that, so that they're really, as a community, off the grid of a for-profit, exploitive, gentrifying model of what it means to live in a city and to live in a community. So Jackson's an interesting example. Detroit has some interesting community land trusts. You all have the benefit of being in cities where there's some land available, right? New York is a little harder. I live in Harlem, and we do have a couple of community land trusts in Harlem and in the Bronx, but they're a very different model because land is so expensive and there's so little of it that's available for, say, the city to sell to a community group for $1 for them to then decide what to do with that land. But I would look to those models, and I don't know if you guys have been as well.
Yeah, we've been in touch with folks in municipalities in Pennsylvania who are doing really powerful community land trust work and who are building these sort of struggles around city resources. So in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia, Cooperation Jackson is a really great example of folks on the ground who are using community land trusts and worker cooperatives and other models like that to continue to one, build self-determination, build the organizing, and build people power in the process. And I mean, we had the privilege of meeting Shirley Sherrod of the New Communities Incorporated in Georgia a couple of weekends ago, and that was the first community land trust in the United States, and it came out of the civil rights movement where leaders were talking with folks about voting and doing those types of things, and people were getting kicked off of their land as retaliation. And so there are so many beautiful examples of people coming together, fighting for each other, and using community land ownership to build power, not only where they were, but beyond their communities, and being able to change what's politically possible where they are.
And I would add, in Oakland, California, there's also a very good example. They have established some housing as well as land areas there, and with the cooperation of the city. So there are examples all around that we can learn from, and I would take this opportunity to say this. There's a number of land trusts in this city, and we need to really seriously think about uniting and working together so we can apply whatever political power, whatever resources we have to make the city recognize those land trusts so that people on the ground can get control over spaces in their community where we can build affordable houses, and we can also create urban farms and feed our citizens. Okay, I just want to put my little bit in there on that. Sir?
Thanks, great event. My question is for Professor Frank. Why do you emphasize community land trusts as a vehicle for reparations rather than financial compensation?
I think it is financial compensation. And I didn't want to take up too much time because I wanted to hear from our other panelists, but the way I say we pay for it is through an increased estate tax. Part of why there's so much wealth that's amassed in white families and in white communities is through the intergenerational transfer of real estate, or the wealth that one has gained from real estate in the white community. And taxing that as an estate tax to keep that intra-family sort of holding of that wealth, I think would be an incredibly important thing to do, and then put that money into a trust, like the trust you have here, but hopefully an even bigger one, that would fund community land or community empowerment through land. So just as we would say about slavery and our opposition to slavery is that my people and my family are not for sale, you cannot see us as a commodity, so too our communities and where we live are not for sale. And what I love about community land trusts is it's not just a check that a white person writes to a black person. It's a way that collectively white people take responsibility for empowering black communities and saying, this is your business to take care of, to figure out what your community ought to look like. And it shouldn't be subject to sale through gentrifiers and real estate folks like our president, the big rat in DC, who make money off of our people and our communities.
Y'all want to add anything to that? No? Okay. Well, I will add one thing. Reparation is one of those hot button issues in America for all people everywhere. How it's going to be applied, who's going to get it, who's going to pay for it, etc. You take a city like Baltimore, there's 16,000 vacant houses, there's thousands and thousands of vacant lots. The city is paying for it, the city owns it, we pay the taxes. It is very easy to turn that land over to people in the community as opposed to selling it to developers for a few dollars, so we can get our reparation because it's right there. It's right there. And nobody's gonna beef about that vacant lot because they've been leaving it vacant. Okay, but anyway, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for this event. My question was around gentrification. To my understanding, and it's not a big understanding, but to my understanding about community land trusts, it will help keep communities in the space that they already are. I'm wondering if one of you all could speak to how it will relieve the pressure of gentrification pushing people out of the communities, because there are still people constantly trying to enter, constantly trying to take space. And so I'm still unclear as to how a community land trust interacts with those people constantly trying to enter.
So a big issue and something that I thought was an important connection in your writing and in the conditions that we experience is that when people were trying to own land together, there was a lot of speculation that was threatening people's ownership. And so we experienced that in East Baltimore, where I am, in Charm City Land Trust. We're situated in McElderry Park, where a significant number of the houses there are speculated on. And there was a lot of important research that members of the Roundtable and Housing Our Neighbors did to uncover why that is. And it's because people make money buying and selling vacant property. They make money speculating, and so that persists. And what's important about the community land trust is, one, that if we're the ones that hold the land, we won't look at it as a commodity. We will use it as a public good. That's what a community land trust essentially is. It's people coming together, making decisions about land, and are able to have ownership and use it for the benefit of the people who are there. And so in that way, removing housing or land from the marketplace puts us in a better position to utilize and benefit from the resources we have. And I think the other piece is that when we see investment coming into our neighborhoods, property values rise. And so there's that development pressure that gets put on our communities where people who have been in the community and are making it what it is, they're not able to benefit from that investment, whether it's a better school or new markets or whatever it is. And so if we don't have a mechanism of maintaining affordability, then that displacement continues to occur. And so a community land trust is a tool to do development, the kind of development that we want, that's controlled by us, but also does that in a way that doesn't displace us in the process. I hope that answers the question.
Next.
All right. I would say affordable housing is not payment for 400 years of oppression. That's number one. Number two, a community land trust is owned by a legal entity. It is not owned by people. So why conflate the issues of reparations and a community legal trust? It's not the same thing. Thank you.
Can somebody answer that? I can't.
I don't think anyone here is saying that affordable housing is reparations. From what I understand, this is the way I look at community land trusts. In most of these communities, they have never had the ability to be self-determinant. And not having the ability to be self-determinant, not having the ability to create true stability through their housing and in their neighborhoods, they existed like flower dust in the wind. And community land trust speaks to the ability to build out our communities in a democratic process that all of us are working towards and create the visions that we want to see without that constant developmental pressure that creating these improvements will remove us from our own communities. And two, it creates the idea that what happens to my neighbor happens to me. And so until we can create that in our, until we have the actual mechanism to actually create that in our communities, we would, reparations to me would not actually work, as part of the reason why I agree with the idea that it has to be land and community control over a check. Because we've seen how it's not just our government, but it's also our banking institutions and other aspects of our communities that have also locked us out of our actual visions.
You know, we're looking at such a complicated problem of healing, national healing and repair, that to talk about any one measure as being adequate, I think is not what any of us are arguing. So I think we see community land trusts as one of the things we do. You know, we also educate our children differently. We tell our history differently. You know, university where I work and other universities around the country are kind of atoning for the role that the university played or universities played in the slave trade and benefited from the sale of human beings. So we need to do many different things, not just one thing. But we have to start somewhere. And I think land is an incredibly important way, property is an incredibly important way to think about both how to address the treating of people as property as part of our national history, but also as a way to empower, as Terrell said, as a way to empower communities themselves today. None of them will be perfect. It's a very complicated problem to solve or even to begin to address. But I don't think any of us would want to leave the impression that we think this is the only thing we should do at all.
And I would just want to add one little teeny thing to that. You're right. It's not reparation. I mean, if you really talk about reparation, you're talking about trillions of dollars, and you're talking about trillions of dollars from America. You're talking about the person, the people that has devastated the whole planet, that's killing the planet right now. And moral suasion is not going to work. There is no morality. There is no sense of we owe you this or we owe you that. I'm from like that old school that says use what you got to get what you want. Like, let's get as control of as much of our community as possible. Let's build the muscle power that we need. Let's build the institutions we need. Then we can push for something different. But from where we stand right now, getting control of our land is the most immediate thing we can do, and we can do it, and we need to do it, and then we can look at something else. But we're not getting out of this, and I know I shouldn't say this up here on the stage. Okay, so I won't. Yeah, I won't. We need to just build from wherever we can build from and go from there. Next.
Thanks. Can you talk about your vision for the $20 million? How would that be spent? How many units and what kind of units would that build, and where would they be situated? And what would that look like? How would people apply for that money, and what kind of organizations would apply for it as well to like get them part of that $20 million?
So that's, I think, like the big point of urgency that we feel is that in previous commission meetings, representatives from DHCD said we want to have a notice of funding availability out in the fall. And so to introduce a concept of we're going to put out the criteria and the requirements and the process for how people will apply for this money and how their projects will be scored and evaluated, and say that they wanted to have that in a matter of months when the commission hadn't spoken about that or hadn't had conversation about that, that was alarming to us. And so the process is that there will be a set of criteria, and what's put forward in our criteria is that the project will be scored. And if they can demonstrate that they're going to promote race equity and that they're doing work in historically redlined or disinvested communities, then they can apply under our conditions, because if they don't do that, then they shouldn't apply at all. And so there's different criteria and different points that are put forward around if the projects are environmentally sustainable, if they're meeting the needs of persons who are homeless, if they are, they're projects that demonstrate across neighborhood collaboration. And so there's lots of ways that we are trying to bake in these big concepts around race equity, permanent affordability, and community control, and that would be, the projects will be weighed and evaluated, and that would be a part of how the resources get distributed, because we know that there will be lots of groups that want to apply for resources from this fund. And what's good about the resources is that they have to, by law, support the preservation or the creation of affordable housing at 50% of the area median income and below, and half of the resources that go into the fund have to support housing at 30% of the area median income and below, which currently is the largest need around housing. That's where most of the residents of the city, that's where their income is, but there is no housing being made for people at 30% AMI. And so we hope that people will come forward and that they apply, but we want to make sure, again, that there's this strong criteria and guidelines that ensure that race equity, community control, and permanent affordability are prioritized in how the resources get used.
Once again, she did a great job. Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right.
Thank you so much for coming out and talking to us today. My question is also about reparations and how it squares up with community land trusts. I know it's been addressed very well. Sure. In my eyes, reparations is something that is active and there is a price paid in some way. And my fear is that some of the land taken for community land trusts is land that otherwise property developers would not go for because they don't see a short-term investment. And that kind of land, and given that how we know that land is very linked to neighborhood effects and where people go to school and so on, it is land that communities may not necessarily want that is best for them. Do you see a mechanism where, apart from a market mechanism where you have more money and you compete with property developers on money for acquiring property, where you can get the land that you absolutely want? For example, land which is good, which already has good public transit, which has good connections with schools. And in that sense, that to me would seem more of an active sense in actually reparating or giving back to this community that wants good access to everything. For far too often, like people who live below 30% AMI are put in areas where it's very difficult to go anywhere or to get to good schools, or you know what I'm talking about. But is there any other mechanism by which you can get more solid land through CLTs?
So one piece to the vision that we put forward, and which is a part of our 2020 vision campaign, is that the city would have an active land bank. And that's one way that communities would be able to acquire land that isn't being put to good use, that is being speculated on, and that we could get control of and use for the purposes that best benefit the people who are in our neighborhoods. I think that piece, the acquisition, like actually getting ownership of land, is also what's going to help create the deep affordability that we need. If we are going to have to continue to compete with large profit-making entities that have been amassing wealth over generations and generations, similar to the situation that was spoken about in the book, we are in a losing position. And the city is consistently choosing which neighborhoods are winners and losers by the way they invest their resources. And so I think that a big part of this is where it is supporting and investing in people, supporting and investing in the ideas and the needs that we have, and doing that in as many ways as possible. So the Housing Trust Fund resources could be a part of that. The city support in site acquisition and getting control of land is a part of that. Having the support to carry out our vision through programs or other practices that the city has at its disposal is another piece of this. And also building that comprehensive development vision, because it's not about building homes, it's about building up communities. And so we know that just redeveloping structures isn't gonna cut it. There's a lot of things that we need to not just survive in our communities, but to thrive. And so having that comprehensive fair development view of what we're thinking about our communities is going to be key to doing the things that you're talking about, not just having housing or land, but real communities where people can grow.
I think part of the challenge of doing this work is coming up with solutions that are actually you can accomplish. So when I first started looking at the Sea Islands, I think ideally you'd say, well, you should give that land back. Like seize the land once again and give it to the people who said they would get that land at the end of the Civil War or their descendants. But that's not going to happen, right? Mark Sanford, former governor and senator of South Carolina, his family owns huge tracts of the land I talk about in this book that they stole from formerly enslaved people. They're not giving it back. And no court would uphold the state taking it from them. So what are we going to do instead, right? If we can't do that, if that would be the best thing we could do, was find a way to go, turn the clock back, what are we going to do that is actually accomplishable? And it's amazing what is happening here that I think maybe 10 years ago you wouldn't have thought you could do. And I think related to that I think part of your question suggests that if we were going to build a community, or if you were going to build a community that was one that came from the community, would it look like the communities that are the wealthy communities in Baltimore? Or would you build community differently? Big houses sitting on lots, isolated from others, where you need a car in order to get to school, to shopping, and that sort of thing? Or would you think community differently? And I think that's what's part of the potential that's so exciting about what's happening here, is that everybody's involved from the beginning of what that community might look like.
I just want to add to that. One of the things that kind of struck me with what you said was like bad land. And for me, as a lifelong Baltimorean who's had the displeasure to live in multiple communities through no choice of my own, it has never been my idea to want to create like a rolling park or something of that nature. It has been to actually know that the communities where not only I have grown up, but my family, my family's friends, and their friends, those communities that have been built on that land, that is something that we actually control, that we actually can change and build upon. One of the things that has grown out of this movement is in different areas of the city, like Charm City Land Trust, actually reclaiming the soil through the things that they are growing in their commons. There's also like the West Side Human Rights Committee that's part of United Workers, where they're in Harlem Park and they actually have a Hope Garden, and they're actually reclaiming that land. They know what has gone into it and are working actively to actually build that up and to actually change not only the narrative there, but also what's possible there. So, yeah, that's just my addition to it.
Next.
Hi, I was told not to give you all a hard time by my boss. I'm not going to say who she is, but I'm going to try, though, anyway. And first of all, Professor, the picture that you talked about there of 3 generations, that's actually a picture of 5 generations of slaves. And there's no amount of material wealth that can repay us for what we've gone through for 400 years. That's the first thing, right? And yet we must try. Everybody else got reparations, well, then give us ours as well, right? I do think that this land trust thing is a good idea. But one thing that I wrote down was, since ending capitalism, and I normally spell that with 3 Ks, is the ultimate goal for many of us here in this room. And I ask, are there realistic timelines being discussed to facilitate that?
Hello. Anybody want to tackle that?
Okay. For me, the ultimate goal, have to answer that in 2 ways. For me, when I was much younger, I thought of reparations as a monetary value for the injustices done to my people. I don't see that as much anymore. For me, the biggest thing that's never discussed about slavery is that it created a subhuman class of people. And we're all human beings. We are all deserving of the rights to determine who we are, where we want to live, what we want to be, and how we want to go about doing that. And that was taken away without a second thought. And so, for me, the ultimate goal is that we have a society where white supremacy and the policies that go along with that is not the main determinant of how far I can go in life. And creating the mechanisms by which I may not be able to recover all of the sweat and blood that my family went through during slavery, but I can achieve the same as my white counterparts without fear that that'll be taken away from me simply because we have not addressed the thinking around my human rights and my value as a human being. So for me, that is the ultimate goal. As for a realistic timeline, part of the reason I say affordable forever is because there is no timeline on how long it takes every individual in our society to reach that point of being able to compete equally with all of their counterparts. And so I would not go and say something like 50 years or something like that, because that would be just an untruth for me to actually say that. And so unfortunately, I hate to leave that open-ended in that way, but I'll open it up to the rest of the panelists if they also want to add.
So what I'll say to the point of ending capitalism is that within United Workers, we do political education and leadership development with the goal of building a movement to end poverty led by the poor. And a big part of that is that the forces that we are up against are sophisticated and they are studied. And so if we have any chance of combating those forces, we have to be just as sophisticated and just as studied so that we can be organized and that we can be unified in the demands that we are making and in creating the world that we want. And so our work is to continue to identify and develop leaders to come together to envision a world that's radically different than the one we have and to take steps to build that. And I think the work of developing leaders and being unified and being as strategic and as studied and as organized as we can be is a big part of getting into that timeline, whatever it may be, but we have to do that work. And so that's what we're doing.
So can I say one thing about it?
Yes.
I don't have to, but I could. So capitalism isn't one thing. It's an evolving dynamic and form of power in the way that the economy and certain actors in the economy gain wealth and hold on to that wealth. So what capitalism is today is very different from what it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So dismantling it is not one thing, but we could certainly wound it. We could certainly make it less effective as a way of harming human beings than it is now. And that's why I focus on the estate tax. In the next 50 years, the experts the economists who look at this say that $59 trillion will be passed from one generation to another in the United States alone. Right? 59, you were talking about trillions of dollars. $59 trillion is a lot of money, right? And part of what makes capitalism work is the privatization of wealth, either in the idea of the private corporation or in private families or in private individuals. Getting at that money and making it impossible to accumulate that kind and hold that kind of money and then pass it on only to your people would, I think, strike a very significant blow at capitalism and what makes it hum. So would it defeat it entirely? I'm not even sure what that would look like, but it would cause it to evolve in ways that may enable more human flourishing than human suffering. So I think that it's an under-focused on issue is the inheritance tax and the private accumulation of wealth in families. I think we're pretty aware of what the private accumulation of poverty looks like and feels like, but we haven't focused so much on the accumulation of wealth and how we actually have the tools to recapture it, redistribute it, and use it for flourishing rather than for suffering.
Okay. Let me say this, because it's like 6 minutes left on my clock, and I like to close on time. I can't do this. I'm going to recognize the three people that want to ask questions. What I would ask the panel to do is whoever addresses whatever they address, keep it short, because we are, in fact, running out of time. We might go over a little bit, but I'm going to be the bad guy at some point. Okay, go ahead.
I keep hearing the word affordability, and I want to know who are the people who decide what's affordable, since each household looks different in income.
You.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. So in the context of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund resources, we're talking about housing for people with no income to housing for people at 50% of the area median income. And we put that forward because that was the need. And so for the roundtable and for the work that we're doing, we want to ensure the human right to housing. That means that everyone should have housing regardless of the amount of money they have. That's what we think would create a world where people are treated with dignity and with respect. And so the Housing Trust Fund resources will go to meeting a distinct need in Baltimore, but not just for people with low income, but also for people with no income.
Okay. All right, next.
My question is very short. Have there been thought of any safeguards to put into place to ensure that once a land trust is effective, that it's not taken away again? Because quite frankly, I don't trust them. Okay, so what happens over time? I mean, it's been taken away over and over and over again. So what safeguards? I don't even think a law, okay, is even possible. Okay, but what safeguards are put into place that can ensure the stability over long term for land trusts for our people?
So, it's fine. So a part of the structure of a land trust is the 99-year renewable lease. So it's communities holding land and having that ability to hold it in perpetuity. That's one part. But I think to your question around how we have tools that we can actually have control and maintain that over time, I think that involves organizing and ongoing stewardship. I don't think that once we get land trusts, our work is over. I think it's continuing to identify leaders, to build that leadership in our neighborhoods, and to continue to address the challenges we face. Ultimately, that's why we wanted to see land trusts in the city in the first place, is because we have these really deeply entrenched, multifaceted challenges that we're up against, and that's one way of creating some stability for people and with people in our neighborhoods. But that continued organizing is necessary because I don't think there's any one solution that's gonna to keep us in control. I think this is a part and a step.
Okay, and it's 8:29. So I want to thank you all for coming out, and I hope this has been beneficial. And I hope we move to the next step, like being engaged and involved over in 417 Fed Street next Tuesday night. And I would like for you all to thank the panel. Some have came as far as rat-infested New York.
My rats are waiting for me to come home.
And hopefully I'll see y'all at the next Real Talk program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.